The SARODIN, Chapter 1. No good, thought Myrmix. He cast a cold dark eye into the empty whiteness all around, and settled back into his perch with a sigh. No good at all. A great mist had descended in the night from off the northern steppes, obliterating everything in a frigid blanket of white so thick that it seemed as though the mountain itself had disappeared. This was of concern to Myrmix, because he was supposed to be watching it. At least, he's pretty sure he was. The Parliament had not been particularly forthcoming with the details of his mission, and the fact that this was a thing for which they were notorious did little to ease his mind. Instead, Myrmix found himself shifting in his perch and shivering now, as much from the chill in the air as at the memory of his audience only the day before. He had been summoned before the Bow of Commons at first light, and could still see their craggy gray heads bobbing up and down on that great swaying limb, as forbidding as a row of granite statues assembled on a ship deck.
"Go to the Thalassian mountain pass," said the Speaker of the Bow.
And then he paused and bowed his head in a manner that suggested he was considering the best way to deliver difficult news. Myrmix fidgeted nervously as he waited for the rest of his directions. But the speaker said nothing, and an anxious moment passed in which Myrmix swore he could hear that thin, reedy whistling sound that sometimes precedes a full-fledged snore. He looked around in dismay, and at last cleared his throat with a tremulous cough.
"Is he still here?"
"It would appear so, Your Honor," said the representative to his left.
"Why is he still here?"
said the speaker.
"Did I give him his orders?"
"You did, Your Honor," said the representative to his left.
"Why is he still here?"
"I don't know, Your Honor."
"Perhaps you should find out."
"Yes, Your Honor." The representative to his left turned to Myrmix. "Why are you still here?" "Sir, it's just that—" Myrmix faltered, suddenly at a loss. "Speak up," said the representative to his left. "It's just that what, exactly?" It's just that once I get to the Thalassian mountain pass, what would you like me to do, sir?" offered Myrmix in what he hoped was his most ingratiating and least offensive tone, then was immediately panicked by the thought that he'd somehow managed to be offensively ingratiating. "Oh," said the representative to his left, as he tapped impatiently at a piece of bark with an unusually large talon. "Yes, He turned to the speaker.
"Well, what is it? Did you find out why he's still here?"
"He's wondering what he should do, Your Honor." The speaker looked at the representative to his left in a mystified sort of way, and rolled the words around in his beak like a distasteful grub.
"He's wondering what he should
do, yes, Your Honor. That is, once he gets there, Your Honor."
"Gets where?"
"The Thalassian mountain pass, Your Honor."
"I don't see what that has to do with anything."
The speaker barked in an oddly petulant tone. "Those were your orders, Your Honor," said the representative to his left.
"They were?"
"Yes, Your Honor. You instructed him to go to the Thalassian mountain pass." The speaker narrowed his eyes suspiciously.
"And do what?"
he asked. "That's what he's wondering, Your Honor."
"No, he is he?"
"Yes, Your Honor." The speaker turned to Myrmix and stared at him as though seeing him for the first time.
"Young sir, I will say this once and in no uncertain terms so that there will be no misunderstanding."
And here his chest swelled with a terrible indignation as he raised himself up to the full extent of his majestic bearing.
"When you are summoned before the Parliament and given orders, you will do whatever it takes."
So ended his audience before the Bow of Commons. And now, with the speaker's words still echoing through his thoughts, Myrmix was unsure exactly when he first noticed the sound. It was a slow and rhythmic that began faintly at first, now growing steadily closer. As it did, Myrmix could feel the ruff of feathers around his neck standing on end, and a peculiar queasy feeling began to rise up in his belly. This must be it, he thought, and as he did, a shape began to appear, spreading like a stain across the shimmering surface of the mist nearby. A moment later, the stain had taken the form of a dark figure, making its way along the unseen mountain path below. As the figure approached, Myrmix was surprised to see that it belonged to a thin, frail-looking man in darkly tattered robes. His face was hidden somewhere deep within the shadows of the misshapen cowl, and he was clearly lame in one leg, leaning heavily on a plain wooden staff as he moved with a deliberate slowness along the rocky pass. Myrmix craned forward in his perch to get a better look, emboldened by the thought that, whoever this fellow was, it looked as though a strong breeze would be enough to send him pinwheeling off the side of the mountain. Plus, thought Myrmix, that staff looks a lot like an old broom handle. And as if in reply to this, the tattered man came to a halt, the abruptness of which caused him to shuffle uneasily in his perch. Now what is he doing? But he could see that the tattered man was very suddenly not doing much of anything at all. He was simply standing there in the middle of the path, waiting. Oh, dear, thought Myrmix, beginning to catch on. Exactly what happened next is not an easy thing to describe. You could say that there was a scream so unspeakably horrible that it seemed to cause the mist to curdle into noxious yellow vapor all around. You could try to write out the sound in words, and it might look something like this. You could even say that it made Myrmix feel as though someone was scraping the inside of his skull with a potato peeler. You could do all of these things and still not quite explain the sheer awfulness of the sound that suddenly tore through the unseen treetops of the mountain forest. And then, just as suddenly, you wouldn't have to try anymore, because the screaming stopped almost as soon as it began. It was replaced instead by a series of unappealing grunting sounds, and after a bit, Myrmix summoned the courage to pry open one eye and found himself looking down on an unexpected sight. 4 more dark figures had dropped from the trees and surrounded the tattered man where he stood on the mountain pass. Savage and wild-eyed, they wore matted furs and mismatched bits of armor ripped from the bodies of their victims, and their hair seemed to explode from their heads in such a frenzy of tangled filth that Myrmix was almost positive he could see the naked tail of a possum that had taken up residence in one of them. Mountain marauders, he nodded knowingly. Poor guy. At least it will be over quickly. He watched as the marauders circled about the tattered man, grunting while waving hatchets and spiked clubs over their heads. This went on for some moments, and gradually petered off, as their enthusiasm appeared to wane with the realization that something didn't seem quite right. Through all of this, the tattered man hadn't moved in the slightest. He still simply stood there, leaning on his staff, waiting. The marauders stopped and glanced at one another in dismay. It suddenly occurred to them they could be dealing with a crazy person. Most victims had the sense to run howling away through the woods, or else to fall down and cry and perhaps do some groveling for mercy. Neither response ever prevented them from being hacked to pieces, but at least it seemed appropriate. This just seemed strange. Having now reached the limit of their capacity for thought, the marauders shrugged at each other and pounced on the tattered man all at once, again with a hearty, "Oh dear," thought Myrmix. "I can't look." But he didn't have to. The mist kicked up in a flurry, obscuring everything that happened next in a cloud of white, from the center of which came 4 rapid, bone-crunching thumps, followed by absolute silence. When the clouds had settled once again, the tattered man was still standing exactly as he had, now with the mountain marauders out cold in twisted array on the forest floor around him. Goodness, thought Myrmix. Then after a moment's reflection, gracious. He watched with a renewed sense of attentiveness as the tattered man stepped over one of the marauders and resumed his way along the mountain pass, only to stop short after a pace or two. He returned to stoop next to the body, reaching down to slide his hand under the greasy fold of its tunic, and then pulled it back out to reveal a small leather pouch resting in his palm. He stood and hefted the pouch in his hand, to which Myrmix could hear the sound of jangling coins. With that, the tattered man turned and disappeared once more into the mist, and Myrmix found himself once more with nothing to do but stare blindly into the empty silence all around. No good, he thought. No good at all. Here's something interesting you might not know about mountains. If you climb one that is high enough, time itself will slow down. Even more interesting, you will have no idea that time is slowing down. You may find yourself exhausted from the exercise and a little dizzy from the thinness of the air, but apart from that, nothing else will seem particularly out of the ordinary. But it will be. Because if you were able to look straight down from the top of a very tall mountain onto, say, a busy town, the first thing you will notice is that the people and automobiles all look like little moving specks resembling ants. This much you'd expect. What you wouldn't expect is to see them scurrying around like crazy, much faster than should seem possible, as though someone had made a video recording of an ant colony and pressed the fast-forward button. Meanwhile, you will feel perfectly normal watching the sped-up video of an ant colony while you eat your sandwich and some Gatorade and maybe some pretzels or whatever else you brought to snack on once you reach the top of the mountain. Your time is moving slower than the time of the people in the town below you. The reason for this gets a bit complicated. It all has to do with light and gravity and a hairy little man named Einstein, who kind of looked like he lived at a cave at the top of a very high mountain, which would pretty much make him an expert on these things. But he's dead now, so we're not going to get a better explanation out of him at this point. And even if we did, he would probably just point out that it's actually the opposite that is true. Time moves faster when you're higher up. But I switched it because everybody knows that ants are afraid of heights. In any case, none of this had anything to do with what happened next, other than to show that mountains, in general, can be very strange places. Myrmix was never more aware of this than now, as he circled around the mountain's peak in search of the tattered man. For as far as the eye could see, the lunatic spires of the Halasians rose up out of the mists, clawing after the sun like some enormous dragon after a shining bauble. And even though he'd managed to find a warm updraft, Myrmix had to suppress sudden chill at the thought that no matter where you went, it was very likely some immense and unhappy thing was always waiting just below the surface. Well, he thought, at least now I know what it is I'm looking for. And on that bit of optimism, he continued to spiral upward into the sky, until at last he spotted the tattered man making his way along the mountain pass. Thought Myrmix. A bit farther along than I'd thought. It was true. In spite of being lame, destitute, and carrying a broom handle, the tattered man had already nearly reached the summit well ahead of what could be expected. Myrmix spread his wings then and plunged upward to try to keep pace, and as the ragged surface of the mountain slid away beneath him, a number of things happened simultaneously. 1. Myrmix spiraled clear of the peak just as the tattered man stepped to the top of the mountain pass. 2. The rising sun at last slipped free of the horizon and poured its light into the desert valley below. 3. Both man and bird were met with the sight of a hidden city that glimmered like a golden mirage in the distance. Oh my, thought Myrmix as he began to spiral nervously into tighter and tighter circles. Is that what I think it is? But of course, he knew that it was.